सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
From his hollowed-out base inside Asteroid M, surrounded by the grim brotherhood of evil mutants, Max Eisenhardt plotted his revenge on the human race. Escaping from the horrors of Kristallnacht and the Warsaw Ghetto, losing his family in a Nazi mass execution, Max had learned to fear power. To ensure the survival of his fellow mutants against bigotry and hatred, he set out to carve out a homeland. That leads him to war fighting the dangerous forces that inhabit the Marvel universe. Perhaps some of you have lived in it. Earlier this year, Elon Musk put a human face to the supervillain Magneto. George Soros, the hedge fund legend who has funneled a staggering $32 billion into his network of open society foundations, which promote liberal and progressive causes around the world. For years now, the far right has characterized Soros as the hidden hand behind a cosmopolitan conspiracy to destroy the agency and autonomy of tradition, religion, nation. Few figures in the West have been subjected to quite so much outright hatred. Fox News had the grace to drop an anti-Semitic on-air slur directed at Soros, but plenty of others are unrepentant. You just have to do some Googling. These ideas are now embedding themselves in the Indian right-wing discourse, often without understanding their anti-Semitic context, as Soros has become increasingly vocal in his criticism of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Soros has been alleged to be plotting the nation's downfall by engineering attacks on corporate jewels like the Adani Group. Even as the ideological war explodes across the cosmos, it is important to understand the real story is less superpowered. Economists Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, Lucas Nunez and Hayden Ludwig, in one of the few thoroughgoing assessments of Soros's work, show that his massive philanthropic contributions have had pretty marginal impacts on political rights, civil liberties or gender parity. There has been no measurable impact despite the money on the influx of migrants into recipient countries, nor an increase in protests, one of the most famous allegations made against Soros. Eastern Europe, where Soros focused his energies and his fortune, hasn't turned out quite as the billionaire planned either. Among the first recipients of a scholarship from Soros, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has become the loudest spokesperson for anti-liberal chauvinism. Georgia, home of the Soros-backed Rose Revolution, has slid right back into authoritarianism. Soros predicts now that a civilizational conflict with China and Russia lies ahead, but his fortune seems powerless to prevent it. The real story here isn't about behind-the-scenes filmic machinations. It's tragic, even radically pessimistic. No amount of cash, it turns out, can buy a liberal culture where individuals respect each other. To imagine that billionaires can shape the course of history is just hubris. The Great Budapest of the 19th century, where Hungarian elites embraced Jews as their own, and the community was among the most assimilated in Europe, was not the one George Soros would inherit. The devastation left behind by the First World War needed a scapegoat, and the Jews were ready to hand. Admiral Miklos Horthy's right-wing government passed the first anti-Jewish laws in 1920. Austria next door and once part of the same empire, embraced union with Nazi Germany. Large-scale anti-Semitic violence had periodically flared in rural Hungary, historian Robert Nemes reminds us, and many Jews may have believed that this phase would also pass. It wouldn't. Fears among the Nazi high command that Miklos Horthy, the Hungarian head of state, might stall the full implementation of the final solution, as their collaborators in Romania had done, proved unfounded. The Hungarian Jewish community was identified, marked, and forced into ghettos. From March to May 1944, they were sent to Auschwitz in numbers so large that special ditches had to be dug to burn the corpses, since the crematoria at the death camp could not cope. George Soros, Soros's father, had planned for this moment. Through networks of friends and associates, he provided fake documents for family and later friends of friends. There is nobody we can turn to, he would observe. And since we can't stand up to Hitler's fury, we must hide from it. Soros would later say, "I learned the art of survival from a grandmaster." Following the liberation of Hungary by the Soviet Union in 1945, Soros found himself living in an authoritarian shadow. He escaped to Switzerland and then London. The indigent immigrant, biographer Michael Kaufman writes, was turned down for a stipend by the Jewish Board of Immigrants, but gained his revenge by claiming benefits for a broken leg long after it had healed. The decision to leave Hungary proved a smart one. Kafka was a realist after all, lamented the theorist and education minister during the 1956 revolution, Georgy Lukács, as he was held in prison after a failed attempt to break Soviet shackles. Later, Soros gained entry into the London School of Economics, encountering the work of the philosopher Karl Popper, whose ideas would shape his life. Like Soros, Popper, also assimilated European Jewish by descent, had fled the rise of fascism, leaving Austria on the cusp of its unification with Nazi Germany for New Zealand. Following the Second World War, Popper obtained a position at the London School of Economics. Though much of his most important work revolved around the philosophy of science, Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, argued for a politics that rejected both communism and fascism. Instead, Popper made the case for a robust liberalism founded on individual freedoms. The attractiveness of this ideal to Soros is self-evident, and in 1979, he turned to the name of his final year tutor's book when he founded the Open Society Foundations. Among his earliest work was providing scholarships to black students in apartheid-era South Africa. Though some individual students benefit, its systemic impact was quite limited. Later, the OSF would move into the decaying socialist states of Eastern Europe and try and light the fire of democracy and liberalism there. For many modern philosophers, Popper provided at best an anodyne manifesto for change. The intellectual historian Mark Leela has described the idea of an open society as an oxymoron, arguing that all societies by definition are characterized by boundaries. For his part, Mark Royer notes that Popper does not address the question of how the open society ought to be governed. The philosopher Rajiv Bhargav argued that Popper had no theory of, and I quote, why violence continues to be deployed in the defense of the most despicable and exploitative social orders, as well as their overthrow. Popper's commitment to individualism, Bhargav went on, blinded him to the historical reality that beliefs, desires, intentions, and actions are inescapably social, that we as individuals don't exist in a vacuum. Even more important, Popper had no clear answer to the questions of how open societies were to use their power, or closed societies were to be defeated. Was it to be through violence, through revolution or dialogue. Soros welcomed the collapse of the Soviet Union and pushed the West, unsuccessfully, to economically aid its reconstruction with some kind of new Marshall Plan. But it's not clear what Soros's views were on the United States' own efforts to undermine democracy from Vietnam to the Middle East and Latin America. The brilliant journalist Christopher Hitchens once pointed to the ideological paradoxes that Popper and other liberals opened themselves up to. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister who crafted the invasion of the Suez Canal in 1952, made little effort to hide his hatred of Jews. British radio, on the eve of the invasion, described Egypt's nationalist leader Abdel Gamal Nasser as, and I quote, a secret Zionist and also a secret Freemason. Yet, Prime Minister Eden succeeded in drawing his own open society, together with another open society, France, and Jewish Israel, into an alliance against Nasser. In an unpublished 1960 essay, the sociologist Norman Birnbaum gently mocked Popper, saying his success derived from making British political prescriptions applicable to all of mankind's ideological ills. I quote the writings of Professor Isaiah Berlin, Michael Polanyi, and Karl Popper are adduced wherever British self-congratulation seeks intellectually reputable credentials, he wrote. Self-congratulation may be. There's a dark side to Soros too. For years now, Soros has thrown his weight behind globalized regulation of the financial system and the geopolitical system, pointing to his own fortune as evidence of the perils that confront unregulated capitalism. In 1992, he mounted an infamous speculative attack on the Bank of England, forcing the United Kingdom to devalue the pound and leave the European currency mechanism. Economic revival did follow after a great deal of hardship, as Britain embraced efficiency. But Soros also lit the fires of Euroscepticism. He thus undermined his own political commitment to the European Union as an agent of a new kind of meta-nationalist liberal order. The similar attack mounted by Soros on Thai currency in 1997 had even more tragic outcomes. It sparked off a financial crisis across Eastern Asia, inflicting enormous hardship, especially on the poor. The liberal economist Paul Krugman wrote that Soros and his like, I quote, actually do their best to trigger crises for fun and profit. He called the plural of Soros, Soroi. For Soros, though, his life as an investor and his philanthropic commitments exist on two separate moral planes. Ever since 2004, Soros increasingly turned his attention from the world to the United States. The triumph of President George W. Bush shaking his certainty that history was headed in a benign direction. Following the defeat of Bush's rival presidential candidate John Kerry, Soros has funneled millions of dollars into successive Democratic Party campaigns. In spite of his reputation for radicalism, though, his choice of candidates have been firmly establishmentarian, among them Hillary Clinton and now President Joe Biden. Soros might be, as his critics contend, a billionaire with a messiah complex. There's little doubt, though, that his money has brought some change to some lives, even if his grand objectives have dissolved in the face of reality. Is that enough? I don't know. There is little doubt his life has been better spent than that of other billionaires who've spent all their money on big cars, jewelry, or art. But money, it should have been long ago clear, can't buy the human race happiness. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you again for watching Security Code.